Testing. Testing. So I'm sharing the screen from my laptop, so that way, like right now, they're still seeing the PowerPoint, not what I'm doing.
Okay, go ahead and talk in the microphone and Emily will let us know.
Testing. Today is February 4th. Testing. Today is February 4th. Okay. Okay. Board of Forestry, Board Retreat Day 1, Wednesday, February 4th, 2026. Today's meeting is streaming live at oregon.gov/ODF, and session begins at 9 a.m.
So the computer in here is what should be controlling the volume.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm already on
Mm-hmm.
and text you if you speak. I can see if it's just coming through at all.
She says she can hear now. So Emily, you can hear us right now? Emily, can you hear me? Okay, so Emily can hear now. So it might be just, you might have to start talking louder. Okay, so Emily, you can see, you can hear and you can see the slides. Is that what you're telling me? You're confirming both of those? Okay. Thank you, Emily.
Gotten so quiet already. Welcome, everyone, to the February Board of Forestry Retreat. This is a two-day event. For the record, I'm Jim Kelly, Chair of the State Board of Forestry. Today's meeting will be live streamed on YouTube, and to make sure our viewers online can follow along, I'll provide some best practices and housekeeping tips, as I always do. Everyone participating in the virtual and physical meeting room, please silence your cell phones and try to limit background noises. For online participants, I think we have any online participants, but if we do, mute yourself when not speaking and disable your video when not presenting or providing public comment. We ask that everyone participating today to state their names before speaking so that those listening can track commentary for the meeting recording. If you experience technical issues in the online meeting room, use the chat function on Zoom to connect with the ODF hosts during this event. For this February retreat, we have no decision items. As a reminder of our general order of operations, after an item is introduced, I'll invite the presenters to begin. Board members, if you have any clarifying questions, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. Presenters, we will do our best to ask questions one at a time. After the presentation, we will shift to a discussion space where the board can ask further questions, or in this case, we won't be presenting any motions. And there is no public testimony for this retreat, but if you would like to share information with the board, we recommend sending written testimony to the Board of Forestry email. To enter it into the record for the February 2026 retreat meeting, all written testimony is due by February 18th, 2026. Any questions so far? Okay, I'll perform a roll call with the board members to confirm that we have a quorum. Brenda McComb?
Here.
Liz Agpowell?
Chair Kelly, I am here.
Keith Curtis?
I'm here.
Ben Doimling?
Here.
Joe Justice?
Here.
Alexei Lovecchio is not here, and obviously I'm here as well. There are no consent agenda items, so we'll roll to the next agenda topic. I'll turn it over to the state forester, but before I do, we had some glitches in terms of information getting to the board, and so we've all had a relatively short time to review materials, and so that's been a little frustrating, and we haven't had any pre-board meetings. So just going to remind you all, let's be gentle with each other and gentle with our wonderful staff, and try to put those frustrations aside. And with that, I'll turn it over to our state forester.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Chair Kelly. So since this is the retreat, Chair Kelly asked me to do a little bit of a review of the state of the agency. And so I wanted to look back a little bit of this last year and some of our accomplishments. And also I'll be looking forward to 2026 and what's going to come in front of the board, as well as what's happening for the agency. So but before I start, I wanted to just take note, since this is a retreat, I've asked our executive team to join us today. So there's several members in the audience, and I'm sure several members in offices. They'll be in and out as we're all trying to do 5 things at once. But just to really appreciate them being here and here to help with answering any questions in the conversation today. So, so I can take a little bit to kind of look back at the last year. So I moved in the state forester position in late January last year, and I think we can all admit it was a little bit of a bumpy time for the agency and some difficult pieces. So as I moved into that, my top goal was to provide some transparent communication for our staff and our board and our stakeholders, so we could have a shared course forward and build trust back with the public. And so I think that's been a key tenet for our agency over the last years. We've tried to move forward on all the important work that we're doing. So in February, we had quickly moved into the legislative session. And after being an agency that at the end of the previous year in 2024 had to ask for a special session, it was a little bit of we didn't know how it was going to go for us in the longer session. So I just want to call out, we worked really hard significant work by Kyle Williams and Derek Wheeler, our legislative director, and came out of the session with House Bill 3940, which provided funds that created relief to landowners for their share of protection costs for readiness and response. And then we also had, through that bill, significant new funding that was created for landscape resiliency and mitigation. And those dollars come from rainy day fund interest, as well as what's called the ZIN tax, or smokeless tobacco products. And in addition, there was an establishment of $150 million in the Natural Disaster Fund for the state of Oregon. And so those were just some significant opportunities that we walked away from the legislative session for. When I look back at the 2025 fire season, so we went from the political firestorm into the actual fire season, we had a significant reduction in acres burned for ODF protected lands, just under 25,000 acres, which I attribute to the incredible work done across the state for initial attack. And as I talked about, that readiness and response that we do. However, in June, the Rowena fire started the season. Unfortunately, devastating for that community, a loss of 56 homes there and residents. And so we knew it was going to be a difficult fire season in a lot of ways. And as the summer went on, we had significant lightning storms almost daily for a while. And luckily, it came with moisture for a lot of those storms. So we had a fighting chance, but we still had our incident management teams were deployed 6 times across the state. And so when I think back to the summer, the ones that really stick with me is Southwest Oregon, having lightning go through there and creating just a number of fires and eventually a complex. They had incredible initial attack down in Southwest to control that the way they did. And then, of course, later in the season was the flat fire near Sisters. I think many of us saw that and remember it. And just a tremendous amount of work by the local resources and our team deployment there. So I want to just say the day in and day out work that none of us really see, like we see the headlines for the newspaper of the fire, the names, all those kind of things, but there is just day in and day out work, response to initial attack of smoke calls, all those kind of pieces. And then I also just want to call out too that we continue our work across the complete and coordinated system with our federal partners, but also the state fire marshal. And we had significant response to fires with the state fire marshal this year. And I think that working relationship is tighter than ever. Last year was also a key year for the State Forest Division. They were creating their final timelines with the Habitat Conservation Plan with our federal services. There have been a lot of challenges at the federal government and the change of organization, but the staffing reductions, the commitment by the services and our ODF staff to stay on those timelines and to work through those and to pull some all-day meetings of just sitting in a room together, editing and working through the details and the questions, that commitment has just been strong throughout the process. And also the forest management plan, as all of you know, went into rulemaking in November. And starting that process, we had 3 in-person meetings and significant written comments that have just closed. And then the Forest Resource Division, they continue to make significant progress on the mandates provided through the Private Forest Accord. And of course, the Habitat Conservation Plan for Westside Forest application went in at the end of last year. So that was a huge lift by that division and by the staff. And then the Forest Resource Division is also working through the 20-year strategy, but also the new funding I talked about from House Bill 3940. So we have funding that's coming in, was secured to start looking at resiliency work, mitigation work across the state. We're also been entered into conversations again with the state fire marshal as they build their community resilience program, and they've worked through their focus groups. So that led to a summit that was conducted in November called Rooftop to Ridgetop Summit that we did in partnership with State Fire Marshal. We hosted over 270, really the practitioners of that work over in Bend. And we also had 8 of the 9 federally recognized tribe representatives there. So it was just an opportunity to learn from each other and discuss how we move forward on the wildfire resiliency and community resiliency for Oregon. So that was a huge milestone. But I also just want to take a second here to just kind of talk about too, while I can talk about each of our operational divisions we're all very familiar with. There's a lot of work just in the agency that's occurred. Our administrative division, business services, resource planning, and our tribal engagement, all of them have just been working hard behind the scenes. And really, I also need to just call out where we do our delivery of services across the state. All of our field and district organizations and offices and everybody are doing things, and they contribute every day to Oregonians. So with that, I don't want to leave it as all Pollyanna, but I do want to, before I look at next year, we've also been dealing with some significant challenges for state funding questions. We've had some direction from the governor's office on some austerity, holding vacancies, those kind of pieces. We've also been working to understand and to watch our federal partners going through significant changes, downsizing, and then of course the federal fire service coming online. But we've stayed committed to working with our partners to making sure we keep our work on track. And so those are the kind of some unprecedented changes that as we moved into the new year that we had not really factored in to our work and what we were going to have to be tracking. So I just want to thank everybody for last year. It's been an incredible year when you look back on the big achievements that we've accomplished there. So now I want to look at the future of ODF a little bit. That is the reason we're all here today, talk about the retreat and moving forward. So I think the biggest item looking forward, of course, is the announcement of KCKC, a selection as our new state forester. She will be, I think, our 15th state forester. And of course, the first woman to be selected permanently into that position in the 115-year agency history. So significant milestone, but also congratulations to Casey. We've shared some conversations and emails, and we're working on a smooth transition to get her into the position. And the Senate confirmation is scheduled for mid-February. I don't have this exact date, but it is mid-February that she'll be going through that process. So with that in mind, today is also the day that we're going to see the revenue projection come out from the state. And this is really the last piece of information that's going to inform the legislative short session and budgets moving forward. Just this week on Monday, the Forest Resource Division with Josh Bernard and Jenna had gone down and done an informational presentation at Ways and Means Subcommittee for Natural Resources to talk about landscape resiliency. And today, we're fully engaged at the Capitol. Derek is down there having more meetings. When I think about our operational divisions moving forward, as I mentioned, the State Forest Management Plan rulemaking process is closing out, and a decision point will be coming before the board in 2026. And as I wrote my notes for today, I think the topic of the State Forest Management Plan is going to be a significant one. The division has been in the planning process for at least 8 years in different ways, and so this is going to be an important decision for the Forest Management Plan and the HCP coming forward. The Forest Resource Division, as I talked about quite a bit here, is the landscape resiliency. This is just, we understand the expectations for success in delivering. We've had 13 programs that have been delivering in a variety of ways, but now that we have secured this long-term funding, this is going to be a significant piece. And we can't accomplish it alone. Like, this is not ODF alone work. So there'll be some done through our employees and our efforts. Some will be done through grants to our pass-through dollars to our partners, and existing partnerships that have been successful in this work. Of course, with working with our tribes and our local communities to move that money and to move that work forward across the state. And also just a significant part in my mind of the contracting workforce out there that's going to have to come forward to help us do this, to really make a significant contribution to the state of Oregon and resiliency work. And so it'll also provide us a diversity of investments in local communities and local jobs, and also for just the state. Moving on to the Protection Division, as we always talk about our readiness and response, our seasonal hiring is in full swing right now, and efforts are being made to update our agreements with our partners and look towards our training plans for the coming spring. We continue to define and redefine our relationships with our new federal fire service partners. So we'll be anchoring what's been successful in the past with all of that, as well as what's been successful with the Forest Service, which will continue to be a separate agency in the fire side. We're also been prepared to respond with our state fire marshal partners as well when needed. And as I said, that partnership, I think, just continues to grow between our two agencies. So, and we'll hear later today, the other guiding principle for the coming year is the Executive Order 2526 for natural and working lands. The executive order, when I read the order, is aligned with so much of the work that we're already doing through our habitat conservation plan, forest management plan, 20-year resiliency work. And so we'll continue to find other opportunities to work with other state agencies to advance the goal of 10% in 10 years. And later today, we'll get a little oversight of that from the governor's office. So with that, looking back and looking forward a little bit, I just wanted to close by saying thank you to the board for trusting me for the last year to take on this role and step in. And I think that I honestly believe we're in a really positive place for the Department of Forestry. So as Casey comes into her new role, she'll be able to really pick up a lot of this work and move it forward and make some significant advancements for the agency and for Oregonians. With that, I will close. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Great to hear all of that, and it may be premature to congratulate you also on the fact that there haven't been any embarrassing articles in the media that embarrassed the ODF under your leadership. So maybe that's a low bar, but it's a good thing. Other board members, before we move on, any opening thoughts or questions or anything for Kate or anything at all?
What do you think? Can I?
Liz, go
Is
ahead.
this time to do this? I'm just wondering. I was going to do it at the end, but I just feel like this is the time that I just wanted to give you a little something, Kate, for your time here and just show appreciation on behalf of the board and myself. And it is, I'm going to.
Is your microphone on?
Is my microphone on? Yes, it is. It is. It's just not closed. Thank you. Lizak Powa, board member. Anyway, so what this is, Kate, it's a little tribal Zuni carving of a bear, and the bear and the carver did this beautiful rhyolite bear, which is, in the emblem of, Smoky Bear almost, but a little bit more. And the bear for the Zunis is a symbol of strength, but it's also of nurturing. And the Zunis see vulnerability and strength in the same way. And so you picked it up in January, like you said, dropped in your lap, and brought us through an entire year. So I just want to give this to you and for your to show our appreciation and just to remember your strength and your nurturing side that we so appreciate. And I really appreciate those almost weekly newsletters. It just, in my busy day, it just keeps me in track with you and with the department. So I want to give that to you. And there's a little corn mill in here that, it tells you how to use the corn mill for the carving.
Anything else at the kickoff here, other board members? Okay, if not, we will, Ben Dwemling is going to tell us what's happening. I think a very short report, as I understand it, on the board governance committee. Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, Chair. And I, as the new chair of the board governance committee, wanted to just give a brief update on the work that we have been doing. Myself, Heath Curtis, and Liz Ekpawa have been meeting regularly to work through a bunch of things in our purview. First and foremost, and I guess I'm going to run through a bullet list. This is all still a work in process, and our plan is to bring most of this to the whole board in March and then ratify it at the subsequent meeting. But what we've been working on is editing and updating our board policy manual to reflect the new relationship the board has with the governor's office, and sort of housekeeping language, sort of cleaning up that language to make it meet the current state of that relationship. We've been working on updating the board performance survey, and there's a nexus to one of the agenda items later. We'll probably talk about that in a little more detail. Work is ongoing, and especially now that it's, I think, going to be disconnected from our KPMs, it gives us some more leeway to do a more wholesale look at that. We, I think, are pretty much finalized our new board member orientation manual and wanted to make sure that was up to date and ready to go. And we've been really wrestling with and working on writing a set of agenda development procedures that will be an addendum to the board policy manual. So that's what we've been working on. We expect to bring those 4 bullet points to you all in March. And that winds us down with a good chunk of the work in front of this committee. There are still a couple pieces that need to be filled out in the board policy manual that we'll be taking up over the course of this year. But that's a quick update on where we are. So huge thanks to both Heath and Liz for hanging in there and wrestling through this fairly mundane technical work, but it's very important for the smooth functioning of this board going forward. And I think it's really important work, and I look forward to continuing to make progress.
I would want to say thank you to all of you. I mean, yeah, it is mundane and hard work. We went through a lot to get this, a lot of work over a lot of time, as all of you remember, to develop it in the first place. And then, of course, we immediately had to turn around and do some editing as the world changes. So we look forward to dealing with that on our agenda in March. Okay, any questions? We'll move on then to the presentation on rulemaking process and procedures. And there he is. Tim Holzbach is going to present here. He knows how to dress for a retreat.
Retreat, I took advantage.
I almost wore my jeans today.
Good morning, Chair Kelly, State Forester, Skinner, members of the board. For the record, my name is Tim Hulschbach. I'm the interim deputy state forester with the Department of Forestry, and we walking through some of the state of Oregon's natural resource cabinet best practices. So the board's had interest in rulemaking since the September meeting. This is a little bit of an augmentation by the governor's office that we've been working on integrating into agency practice as well. Much of it has been modeled off of the practice between the department and the board already, but as you walk through, you'll see some things on the slides that are already, we already do something like this. So I wanted to walk through. This is what the governor's office has put together as direction to state agencies for implementation. So next slide.
And before Tim starts, I just want to say I made a copy of this, and it was with all of your packets this morning. Okay, perfect. Thanks.
So this direction came out from back in last May from Governor Kotek around rulemaking in general, trying to increase transparency and having just more of the how to get involved in the rulemaking process by the public, especially in the natural resource sector. Those 14 agencies have a lot of the same folks that do provide comment or are impacted by various rules. So trying to provide some consistency across all the agencies to the extent that can be done so that folks aren't chasing down 14 different processes. So with this, some of the updates, pretty straightforward, is all the proposed temporary and permanent rules on an agency website. So this just brings folks into alignment for those expectations, that public comments during rulemaking are posted, and that there's an annual rulemaking calendar. A link to the Secretary of State Rules database, which is where the clearinghouse of all state rules, and also continuing to post to the Oregon Transparency website. And that's the official website of public meetings, transparency, rulemaking, all of that stuff for the state of Oregon, to have it hosted there. and also follow all Secretary of State processes. So the department at the time that this directive was issued, we had all these processes currently in place. The only additional thing is we did some remodeling on the website to make sure that it was within one click of getting 2 rules from the homepage. That was the one addition we had to do to ours. So as had most of our stuff posted with this. With this as well is consistent to follow all legislative direction. So every time the legislature directs an agency to make rules, they give us guidance on consult with someone or coordinate with someone. So that's all still implied. This doesn't override any of the legislative direction as well. And to follow up with that, and also to follow the Administrative Procedures Act. That's also implied in these best practices. Next slide. One of the biggest ones on the previous slide was a requirement for as the departments fill out fiscal impact statements or impacts from legislation to actually include the impacts from any required rulemaking as well. So with 14 natural resource agencies, they had a few principles that they wanted to follow. One was to be more efficient, so streamlining some of the processes while adding feedback loops. Transparency, so refining how opportunities for public engagement are executed, and also creating opportunities for interacting with our boards and commissions within the constraints of open meeting law. There was noted throughout this that the way that the board and the department interact with rules is a good model to follow in their different processes as we go. So an opportunity to provide feedback that's iterative throughout the process was important. Next slide, please. So out of all the rules that they talk about our state government does, they broke them into 3 classes. So there's tier 1, which is standard non-controversial, the kind of yellow tier, which is the gray area, and the tier 3, which is the high public interest and substantive. And the department generally, most of our rules that we get a lot of input that we have a lot of input on are in that tier 2 area. And then also in that tier 1, that's where most of the rulemaking for the department falls. Next slide, please. So a few items in here, and I'll probably be a little lighthearted as we go through some of them, is that they talk about project memos. The project memos in these slides are that internally in the department, they have to let the director know that they're doing rules across agencies. Some of them, that was a problem. So they wanted to correct that. So the reference to a project memo in these is just a internal documents that the coordination of rulemaking internally, the planning of when it's going to occur, and where that agency leadership needs to be aware of it. Generally, rulemaking is on the board's work plan, so we're well ahead of trying to make sure that folks are aware of upcoming rulemaking as we go through this process. So this is well on its way at the department here. An example of tier 1 rulemaking for the department is something like a district boundary change or any of the rules that are passed through the consent agenda. As an example, some of those housekeeping more so than whatnot. There's a couple items in here. There's the RAC guidance that's listed on the bottom. That means a rules advisory committee. There's a term that's used interchangeably throughout the presentation here, a rules advisory committee or a technical advisory committee. The difference between the two is a technical advisory committee comments on the rules themselves, part of the wordsmithing construction process content. The rules advisory committee does not comment on the rules. They comment or they provide input into the fiscal and economic impact on there, according to the Administrative Procedures Act. So a little bit of terminology throughout the process. The department, we utilized our technical advisory committees as rules advisory committees for many of our functions, and we combine those processes together. Next slide, please. As we get into the gray area, the font gets smaller, but there's more content on the slides. So get into a little bit more of the planning process with rulemaking when we get into the both tier 2 and tier 3, and they're very similar in that initial planning process. So it's ensuring that we have sufficient time in the planning process to account for notifications, to work through public participation, and also including agency leadership in the with those processes and awareness. The expectations is more than a minimum level of process. So with under the Administrative Procedures Act, they have it outlined of having public hearings on rules and what pertains to those, having virtual options for attendance, taking written comment, those types of things are outlined. So, but also looking at where's best practices for ensuring that we are soliciting the feedback that we are looking for. But it's not, this is a kind of an area where it's just on between, it's a robust rule set where it's doing programmatic changes, thinking of like the smoke management plan or something to that effect where it's a significant and it does impact different groups, but it's some aspects of it. I think the smoke management plan has over the last decade fit all three of these different categories we're going to talk about today. So, so this timeline that is referenced in here is in the directions already built into the process at the department. So generally for rulemaking, they say there's a rule package, it goes to a board, and then it goes out to public comment, and then it goes back to the board for approval. At ODF, customarily there's that we add a permission to start rulemaking, and we let have a presentation to the board on the front end of the process of what the intentions are, what some of the proposals are. You think through how we kind of started off the hazard map with a presentation to the board on kind of the statutory overview of that. So that's kind of the department has added that extra process into here already in this process. Next slide, please. So more gray area. We get into the technical advisory committee or rules advisory committee process. The direction is to have balance in those. So a lot of either affected parties or could be affected parties or interested parties having a balance of representation when you have opposing views to have a good rule package in the end and get that feedback. There is recognizing there's always legislative constraints or directions on what we're allowed to do and what not, regardless of the feedback that we do receive, but also including having feedback loops built into the process that if something's brought up, it's analyzed and it's a modification, or if it's not included, providing a little bit of a why that it's not part of the package there. So, and that's part of getting into the feedback loops with as we go through robust, multiple rules advisory committee meetings that have iterative process in the development of rules. Not all rules will have rules advisory committees or technical advisory committees, depending on the legislative direction for them. Some of them some rules have very little discretion that the department has where feedback's needed to move through the process, and it's more of an administrative implementation arms than a policy direction. So those are the types of things that consider between type 2 and type 3 rules. Also with public engagement of having at least one remotely accessible rule hearing, generally with complex topics. Most department meetings are treated as public meetings, and that allows us to provide some time for lots of opportunities for comment on a wide variety of subjects. So you've seen those on the Smoke Management Advisory Committee meetings, the Committee for Family Forest Land. So we use our committees to gather some of that process on our rule development to get some feedback to provide those additional opportunities outside of the rules advisory process where we're actively soliciting feedback from those members, but also additional from the public. And throughout this process, anyone can submit comments at any point in time to the department. So during the pre-rulemaking process, while the rules are being drafted before that, there's an opportunity for input. And then afterwards with the Secretary of State, once that initiation filing is processed, then we have the official rule comment record. And those are two separate things. Next slide, please. And happy to interject with any questions that you have throughout this too, or write them down and we'll capture them at the end. So Tier 3, these are the ones that have the greatest public interest. So new initiatives, new impacts to private lands, new stuff, new significant state policy that's being implemented, thinking about Senate Bill 762. And the items came out of that is a prime example of something that's new, that's large, and has a lot of has certain policy discretions along with it. The private forest accord, contrary, was very discrete, had very limited policy space in there. So that would have been a tier 2 just due to that nature, but where they have more policy space to have those discussions about how to move forward and how to develop a program, that would make it a tier 3. So just want to add that in there. The having discussion, this was where the emphasis on having more discussions with boards and commissions as the rulemaking goes on and updates onto those process and iterative processes. For the wildfire hazard map in particular, we utilize this as having the board members, they were invited to the meetings as we went through theirs and were as a part of the discussion. And we're aware of the process a lot more in depth, and we're invited to those opportunities as well. So a little bit of a difference in that. The high profile political nature of some of those items is what really makes a tier 3 a tier 3. So it takes, when there is no time constraints on the rulemaking process, these are the rules that take the longest to develop a robust and socially accepted result. Public comments paramount in these, and also providing responses to those comments, opportunity for interaction and whatnot. Yeah, so the hazard map is probably my best example for this one, just having to live through that process. If you would have taken away the timeline, we would have had a full type 3 or tier 3 rulemaking on that. So this gets into more balanced representation for Rules Advisory Committee. What you'd have for these types of rulemaking would be the technical advisory committee is what it would be under the Administrative Procedures Act. So you'd have folks who represent others or represent various groups or impacted individuals, and would have that as a focus group along with additional opportunities for the public to provide impact on the creation and the design of the rules. Before the notice, we'd be working through with that group as working on iterative drafts towards the rulemaking process, towards introduction to the board on that. Generally with the department, we utilize pre-rule scoping exercises before we would engage in something that's an update to routine business. The smoke management plan, which is between the department and DEQ, is there's always discussions initially between staff. So we have alignment between the departments to have 2 agencies and a commission and a board step into a complex rulemaking. We work through those ahead of time. Along with OHA from that example, and then would engage in that process with interested parties and then the board as well. Okay. Next slide, please. Oh, go ahead.
I don't know if we can ask, like, as we're going, but if you go back to that last slide, I don't know who's controlling that. It talks about at the end, at the bottom, it says that agencies are expected to continue to provide RAC members and the public with clarity on direction as public comments are reviewed, with the goal of ensuring that they understand the agency's general inclination in response to substantive comments raised prior to proposing final rules for adoption by a board/commission. If necessary, agencies should open a second public comment period for this purpose. This is the part that's always confused me. Right? That is to say, we get public comments that we think are good and substantive comments, and we alter the proposed rule in response to those comments. The public may not have had an opportunity to weigh in on the manner in which we altered it. That is to say, that may be new. How much change between the comment period would trigger this idea that we need to open a second public comment period on the draft rule? You know, it's always, the agency has come to this board in the past and said, wow, if we change very much, we're going to have to go out for another round of public comment, which has been kind of a way to put brakes on the Board of Forestry from monkeying with the agency's rule. By the same token, sometimes we want to make changes and the agency agrees that there need to be changes, but it's always kind of opaque about when that might trigger a second round of public comment. I wondered if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think we'll talk about that a little bit more today. In general, when there is a initiative or new things come to light for rulemaking, or we miss something in the process, and it fits in with the legislative intent, there may and a rule has deviated due to comments. Sometimes it does need to go back, and we usually rely on our working with the Department of Justice to help us provide some of that guidance. If as we get into we have the notice, what is in the notice is generally what we think is the final rule. And then it would go but through the Secretary of State comment, that and then would be finalized with the board afterwards. What we try to, as we work through the process, when we propose it to the board, we try to have as much of a final as possible to go through these rounds prior to the board proposing, or us proposing, a final draft and initiating that in the process under the APA. There's been avenues where we've had, I think we were over in LeGrand in 2018 with smoke management, where the board, the department and DEQ thought that we had a draft ready to go into the Administrative Procedures Act process under the Secretary of State. And the board directed the department to add to modify the proposal before it went to public comment because of some testimony at that meeting. So the board actually modified the rule before it went into the notice. So it's been a lot of this one. I would say it's less concrete in a process or straightforward. Sometimes there's a few loops on the road as we move through it.
Yeah, in order for us to make those changes prior to the final document, it seems we would have had to release a draft of that proposed rule in advance of that decision and have received comments from the public on it in order for us to do that, right? And so, maybe it's the distinction between kind of our informal public comment process where we're putting things on the Board of Forestry's website relative to actually publishing it, on the register. But I don't know, this cuts both ways for me. Sometimes I don't want the rule to change. And I want to say, we can't afford another public comment period. We need to stick with what we've got written. Other times I'm the guy who wants to change and I'm like, hey, the agency's locking us up for no reason. So I was curious. And by the way, we've asked Matt and Annika this question before too, and their answer was kind of equally unsatisfying. So don't feel bad.
I don't know if that's a compliment or not. So yeah, I had a thought and I lost it, but it's an interesting process as we go through. There's times where, regardless of the amount of comment we get, there's no room to change the rule that's proposed. And that's always a challenging space.
I guess, Heath, I really appreciate you bringing this up because I struggle with this exact same thing. And I guess maybe a follow-up question to this is, what's the board's role and authority in driving that process? Like, how much can the board say we're going to, obviously I understand sometimes there are deadlines that we're beholden to that are outside of our control. Otherwise, it says it's if necessary, like it seems like it leaves it open that the board could choose to put it out for public comment again, postpone the final adoption. Am I correct that the board has that authority to do that?
I would, yes. But you caveated that the front way, a significant number of the rules that the department has been designing or trying to adopt with the board over the last several years have had deadlines, and that creates, but that was also the legislative design. So the legislative design with an executive agency and a board, it all comes into the mix of trying to balance those processes out. In areas like the smoke management plan coming up, that where there's no statutory deadline, that would be a normal process that we would go through as opposed to new rules being created. So just want to separate those two a little bit.
So I'm taking that as we have quite a bit of authority if we want to take it. Okay. Just wanted a little clarity. It's great to have these tiers, or I'm thinking of them as little boxes. Who's making a decision what tier it is at the beginning of the process? What's going to be the communication when things are first presented to the board? Is you guys going to say, are you going to color it? We're approaching this as tier 1 or tier 2. What's going to be the formal approach on that?
So with this, we did put together a process internally for rulemaking that mirrors this for implementation to be the executive team and ultimately the state forester who does make those as the official to make those differentiations. And as we work through, if the board would like, we can add in the tiers into the staff reporting and such as we move through the process. So we do have a lot of touch points with the board. I would like to, especially around rulemaking and with the board work plans, utilize that as a tool to help with the communications, especially since those are usually created after a long session when we have our policy direction from the legislature.
And how often do you think it'll happen when you've approached something, say, as a tier 1, that you realize all of a sudden that you misjudged it and it's actually tier 2 or tier 2 to tier 3?
I would say generally the department's pretty conservative. So we would usually err in that most of what we do, unless it's something that we put on the consent agenda before, would be tier 2.
Yeah, thanks for the questions from Heath and Ben and you, Jim. I'm sitting here thinking about, if you were not in that position, Tim, and somebody else were to step in after you were retired years from now, would they make the same decisions that you've been making? My analysis is that this is incredibly subjective. And it's not clear to me who has responsibility for oversight that would ensure consistency over time and over people. So who is the authority overseeing this process to be sure that there's consistency?
Yeah, that was so that's the way we put it into department policy to help us assist with that. The challenge what's actually spawned this PowerPoint and direction was 14 natural resource agencies doing things extremely different and not involving their boards or not involving their stakeholders in the processes. And I believe the interest groups asked the governor's office to try to get some more consistency. And that's where this came from. Most of these processes we currently had in place. And it's just routine to the way that the department and the board operates.
I'd strongly encourage you to include very clear criteria for any decision that you would make within this process so that the agency, the board, or any other group can fact check that and make sure that those criteria are being met. Right now, the criteria are pretty mushy.
Also going to make a suggestion that since we're going to have 3 of us come off this board in this coming year, that make sure that we have this memo on the different tiers as part of the orientation for new board.
Mm-hmm.
Including the qualification that we don't actually know what it means, and we'll tell you when we get there.
Anything else at this point? You didn't quite get through your whole presentation before Heath interrupted you. Sorry.
So, yeah. So there's some Again, the public engagement and the board and commissioners engagement, those are the portions that were emphasized. So again, the way the department presents information to the board, of seeing the draft rules before they go to the Secretary of State, having that be part of the package, having the final rules be part of the approval package at the end. Those are processes we already had in place with that. So in the public engagement piece, we generally do more than one meeting as a practice of itself. We've commonly, instead of the 30-day minimum for the APA, we commonly do 45 days or more for complex rules. So some of these best practices we're already exceeding and have no intention of not. And that is the last slide.
Yeah, if we've got time for questions, I had a couple follow-up questions, big picture. This is really helpful. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to sort of outside of this policy memo about how you shall do it, to some of the pathways to initiating rulemaking, how these will come about, these efforts. I think that would be very helpful for us as a board to sort of fully understand those multiple different pathways that we get to this process.
Nope. Yeah. So the most common way lately that we've engaged the board with rulemaking is the legislature giving us you shall do rules. Or you will create a new program by rule. And we usually get pretty explicit directions in the creation of those new programs. The second portion of it is the governor's office could direct the department to look at our rules in certain places. Interest group could petition the board. In certain respects, there's some avenues there. And then the department initiates rulemaking as we review and upgrade our policies. Our district boundary changes are a common one, the smoke management plan. Those are routine rulemaking processes. And we usually aim for and also the Secretary of State has a rule review requirement that every 5 years, the department reviews our rules for effectiveness if they're having the targeted outcomes, and if not, what the plan is to make them more efficient. So those are kind of some of the things that weigh into it. And then it's prioritized among all those processes. Obviously, anything with deadlines or associated executive direction is priority. And then as we there may be things in the legislative process that are unfolding to make a rulemaking easier or more effective so that we don't have to go through it twice. So that's it's a nebulous concept of prioritization, but those are about the 4 or 5 different ways that something could be initiated.
Following up on that briefly, you mentioned an interest group could petition the board. It sounds like that through that pathway, or there might be another pathway. Can the board unilaterally initiate rulemaking? Obviously within the parameters of our authority, but I'm assuming that is a pathway as well.
I believe the board could ask the state forester and that's common that the board would ask for a review of some sort of a process or another, or an update or an introduction to it. So I don't think that would be outside the realm of cooperation for sure.
And just curious, when, what the time frame for the next 5-year review is? When?
It's 5 years from the date that the rule was put in place. So they are all.
Oh, so it's not like one wholesale review. It's each rule has its own.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and we have several staff that coordinate that, as you can imagine, the different rule sets we have.
How dynamic is that review process? I know you're saying you're required to do it every 5 years. Do you guys think you're doing a good job of that?
I believe so. It was put in place, believe in 2012. So it's rules that are new since that time. So it's not all of our rules, but as we do our routine rule updates for our business, all of them will start hitting that same review process. It's the form itself isn't very in depth, but it is to document, and it is submitted with the Secretary of State that so that they have it on file of what our assessment is.
Have we actually had a lot of changes that have come out of that review process come forward? pushing a little bit on this because
Yeah.
this is the kind
Yeah.
of thing that government gets criticized a lot about having a lot of rules that are no longer, really used or updated.
Yeah, the smoke management plan and some of our district boundaries are some of our longest standing rules that have been in place without a modification. So our district boundaries are reviewed through forest line classification as the iterative process to redefine those. The smoke management has been part of that process. It's been delayed just because of nationwide policy changes regarding prescribed fire and waiting for some of those to go through. So we put that into the memos back to the Secretary of State of taking a tactical pause to be able to work through and be more have more opportunity for that specific subject matter.
Yeah, this is interesting. I was not aware that you had a review process in place for rules that have been made, which strikes me as kind of a key component to adaptive management. You take the information, you make a decision, you implement the decision, review the output, and then ideally you would go back and revisit that plan or that decision and improve it. How often is that happening?
It's challenging with the amount of rules that are new. So we're going to have a big batch of them that are going to be coming up on that 5-year timeline over the next 3 to 5 years with that. So as far as the iterative process, many of our rules have been in place for a while. Thinking the ones that were initiated by the department, there's around our enforcement policies, our fire prevention laws, and smoke management are the ones I go back to because those are the ones that we've updated but haven't had a statutory change. There's our certified burn manager program will be on the docket coming up here soon as well. Private forest accord will be a bit before those rules hit that 5-year review timeline.
Quick follow-up. So if you decide that there is an improvement to be made in an existing rule, you have to restart rulemaking, correct?
Correct. But it depends on the topic and the subject and what the change is, and which would identify which of those tiers the rulemaking would fall in.
Is the board kept informed about all of these reviews and steps that are taken? And
Well, they're informed of all the rules that are updated and through that process. So whether it's an administrative update or a deeper dive update into the process.
It would change a lot depending on what tier you've put.
Which tier it is, and and if the review is if the rule is meeting its intended outcomes, whether and then if it's meeting that, then we call checkbox and move on. So it's when it's not meeting those, or it's out of date, or needs an administrative change, or even a wording change. That's usually what we find throughout the process, and those are the items that end up on the consent agenda for an administrative fix. Yeah, what we generally find through those is rule reference or statutory reference changes. Those are the ones like where that's the process that what we usually uncover throughout.
Everybody had enough coffee?
It's a robust topic to start the day.
Other questions for Tim on this subject? Pete?
Well, just to respond maybe to Ben and Brenda a little bit, it feels like I could see saying, hey, like we need to know if that rule is working. We're the ones who kind of voted on it. It needs to come back to us and report and say, hey, did we accomplish our objective? And that I think that would be fair. And it's not quite what I heard Tim say. Another avenue for that line of inquiry is probably the effectiveness monitoring, right? That is to say, are we accomplishing the biological objectives we have, and that the outcome of that kind of monitoring could prompt or drive the rulemaking that you're asking about. And I honestly don't know about the timing or reporting on that kind of effectiveness monitoring and how that would cycle into the rest of our work plans either. And maybe you could respond to that, Tim. I would be interested if to the degree that the forest practice rules, we're monitoring them for their effectiveness. Do we have a regular timeline for coming to this board with findings or conclusions relative to that effort?
I'm not sure specific to reporting out on the Forest Practices Act. However, rule specific wise, if something was, and there's a difference between the rules and the key performance measures or other metrics associated based on the rules. So I just want to keep those concepts a little separate. So the rules themselves, as far as the effectiveness of the intent of the rule and it meeting its legislative direction and that type of stuff, that's what was reviewed under those reviews.
Yeah, I mean, that gets a little fuzzy, right? Like, is it protecting resources? Like, what does that even mean? But fine. I only mean to say, I think that, our forest practice rulemakings, which are usually the ones this board is most interested in, are mostly driven by the effectiveness.
Thanks, Heath, for that. Who makes the decision about whether it's effective or not effective?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that further.
Is it ODF or is it the board or is it an independent agency? Is it DOJ? Where does the
No.
buck stop?
In the context of rulemaking, the effectiveness of the rule would be it meeting its legislative intent.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
Oh, sorry. In the context of rulemaking, it would be ensuring that the rule meets its legislative intent. So is it still connected to its supporting Oregon revised statute? Is it meeting is the terminology or the wording throughout the English language changed? And do those words mean something different and we need to have an update, those types of things?
But to Keith's point about effectiveness monitoring, somebody has to interpret that data and make a decision.
Correct. And that's gets to my previous of the difference between a metric and the rule language in the law.
Yeah, and maybe it's just that your designated task in terms of your 5-year review of the rule is much more narrow inquiry than whether or not, it's working. And that's maybe kind of a legal analysis. I still think though that there's a legitimate question about the degree to which, well, on most of the water quality parameters, the MOU with DEQ will probably drive that analysis, and they'll have some opinions about that and bring it to us. In terms of, uplands and species protections, it's hard.
I think it comes back to criteria. You have to have objective criteria if you're going to check to see if you're being effective or not. So if those aren't built into the process, I think becomes incredibly mushy.
It's kind of like the rule itself has, for instance, like the 2017 stream rules have buffer widths, and that's a form of criteria. And you could monitor whether or not you're implementing those buffer widths. Whether or not it's meeting some temperature objective is not inherent to the rule itself, is kind of how we analyzed it. And so I don't know that ODF has spent a lot of time developing those criteria in the first.
Yeah, we have time. We're good.
I sort of a different track here. I appreciate this conversation and I agree with what you're saying. Can you speak a little bit about the ODF specific framework within which we work on rules? I'm thinking specifically of like 714 analysis, and there's a number of, excuse me, there's a number of sort of hoops that we have to jump through for ODFs in particular, separate from those other 13 agencies. Can you speak to some of those?
Yeah. And I'm gonna bring up Josh to talk about the 714 analysis. I got to phone a friend on that one.
Need to go into great detail,
Yeah.
but just highlighting that
Yeah.
there are some, in addition to what was on that memo, there's some additional hoops, correct?
Yeah, so for the department, generally, we let the board know we're going through a process and what our intent is in that. So when we're initiating, especially when we're initiating something, but when we go through legislation, we give that introduction to the board for the process. We consult with the folks we need to for the subject matter, the for groups affected by a particular rule and whatnot. And then we utilize that body of work to come back to the board before we would move towards any official public hearings or APA process. The board has that input as those portions on there as we track through. We would go through and then we would kick off the official 30-day rulemaking process with the APA and then come back to the board for a final vote. That's kind of the nutshell with the department. Of course, it's a little nuanced depending on the subject matter. I know the 714 process has some specifics though with the any deviations.
Yeah, so for the record, Josh Bernard, Forest Resources Division Chief, and maybe Ben, you could just restate the specific piece so I can zero in on that because there's a lot of material around what we've been discussing.
Well, I guess my question was fairly broad of, I'm guessing each agency has their own set of parameters for making rules. Can you speak to some of the ODF specific parameters within which we have to work that are in addition to what the Secretary of State's going to put out or the governor's office puts out for all 14 agencies?
Yeah, I can think of two examples right off the top for Forest Resources Division. So one would be the 714 analysis, which I think was mentioned earlier, right? And so anytime we're, there's several sections, right? But the big one is like when we're changing the standards for landowners, it creates several steps of walking through degradation finding, et cetera, that we need to do that's layered on top of all the requirements that you see here. In the past, we've received petitions for threatened and endangered wildlife species, right? And there's another process there. I think it's 527.710, if I got it right off the top of my head, which covers both water quality and T&E. That triggers a special requirement where we have to generate a report that covers the biology of that species as part of the rulemaking process. So there's other things that are tacked on to the APA, the governor's expectations, et cetera. So those are two right off the top of my head that come.
Go ahead, Heath.
I have one more for you, Tim, and you may not have an answer to this either. If I'm pretty confident that, well, I know for a fact that the forest management plan that we intend to adopt will be a rule. Strikes me as a tier 3 rule in that process. Is it your intention to observe this guidance in the context of that rulemaking? And then kind of the second question is to the degree we're supposed to have 5-year reviews on those rules, will you accommodate me requesting to have 5-year review 5 years from now on the FMP?
I'll start with the second piece of that. Yes, because I believe this will be the first forest management plan that since the 5-year SOS review has been in place. So that will be part of the process. As far as what they're doing through right now, there are public hearings on the rules. There are public hearings on the plans. There's written comment being received, and it's well beyond what is currently on the in the current guidance.
The only exception may be the rack tack,
Yep. Yeah, and that one's I'd say that as we go through, so the technical advisory committee, there's been a substantial amount of stakeholder input into our forest management plan over the last 5-6 years from the HCP moving forward. So I would say that that meets the intent of what the governor's office is aiming for that involvement. And also there's still opportunities to provide further comment on there as well. So both in the development and in the impacts.
And so if I might, just because there was a question about, I think I'll say effectiveness monitoring relative to the PFA rules, et cetera. And so just so everyone's tracking here, right, we have a separate and distinct process for that, right? That will happen through the adaptive management and the independent science and research team. So that's how true effectiveness of like the new forest practice rules will be assessed. I think just, as Tim was talking through the rule review process with Secretary of State, I think if you were to look at that process, it's a standardized form that comes from the Secretary of State that we go through and answer a couple narrative questions and check the boxes. It is not an in-depth review of, is this rule in this riparian area effective at achieving the purpose statement that's described in rule? It's more like, is the rule still needed? Is it working? Meaning I think people understand it, do those sorts of things, and is there a impact on small businesses? Like those are the criteria I remember seeing in that form previously. So I just wanted to kind of share that to distinguish those are significantly different processes. And my understanding is I believe it's only on new rules. It's not a review of something we passed in, 2015. We already did that rule review once and we haven't cycled back, and there's not a requirement to. So just wanted to provide that clarification, at least
That's super helpful.
for forest resources stuff.
Tim, I'm still going to be on this board in 5 years unless they remove me, so we'll check back in.
Look forward to giving this presentation again.
Okay, any other discussion on this topic? Thank you very much. We'll be seeing you later. All right, next up is a review of Robert's Rules of Order, and we're slightly ahead of schedule, but I see that Matt DeVore has arrived, so he has perfect timing. Turn it over to you, Matt, if you're able to sit down.
Good morning, Chair Kelly, members of the board, Interim Forester Skinner. Thank you for allowing me to be here this morning. The topics of Robert's Rules I know has come up in some previous meetings and some, yes. The topic of the Robert's Rules of Order has come up at some previous meetings, and I understand the board has requested some direction on what the rules require. The first thing that I would say is that the department has rules that adopted the Robert's Rules of Order as the parliamentary procedure. But the rule also includes a statement that the board can make other rules or take other actions that do not directly comply with the Robert's Rules of Order. So from a legal perspective, I would say that the Robert's Rules are there as a guide to help provide some direction and default, but they aren't going to be a legal requirement that you follow. So from the perspective of DOJ's legal advice, I can't say that the Robert's Rules are something that must necessarily be followed. The board has some discretion to come up with a process that works for the board. And if those Robert's Rules are not providing you the guidance you need, you can come up with your own process. So I do not have guidance on how to follow the Robert's Rules. I would suggest that if the board wants to have training specifically on the Robert's Rules, that could be something that a facilitator could provide, or even perhaps look at finding ODF staff that have expertise in the Robert's Rules that could serve as a sort of parliamentarian for the board. But what I think may be more helpful is if the board would engage in some discussion about how it would like to see motions be handled, for instance, so that you can all come to some agreement about the process that you would like to follow. If the Robert's Rules provide you with some helpful structure, that would be great. But if you want to come up with some specific process that works for the board, that would be within your discretion as well. So I apologize if this is not providing the sort of debrief of the Robert's Rules, the in-depth review of the Robert's Rules that you may have been looking for. But from a legal advice perspective, I would say you've got some discretion and some room to come up with your own direction. But DOJ's role in providing training on the Robert's Rules, we just don't have that training available, so I didn't have anything available to offer on that specific point.
Okay, thank you. I think I guess it's comforting to me, since I haven't been the tightest as a chair could be with following Robert's Rules of Orders. So it's nice to know that I haven't, at least on a legal basis, screwed up. But I think this really is an issue about how do we Jess handled particularly the discussions and how to handle motions well, respectfully. So I'm open to feedback. Since I'll be exiting this year, as well as several of you, it seems like a formal primer on Robert Rules of Orders probably a waste of time at this juncture, but might be good down the road. And I think I believe in the past they have typically handed out to new members a copy of Robert's Rules of Orders, and hope we continue to do that, because I have no problem. I think it is a good guide. But my personal style is not always to be too regimented around those kinds of things. So anyhow, what are others' thoughts on this subject? Joe, you've watched all.
Thanks, Joe Justice, for the record. So I was the one that brought this up to bring this in front of the board, Brenda. So you can thank me for this discussion. And Matt hit upon it. And since, the three of us have been on this board and seen, decisions being made, speaking of us three, we've had some very awkward times. And I think it's always good to kind of review, just like Matt said, how do we navigate this sometimes? And that, like Robert's Rules of Order are there to kind of help us, navigate that. And he hit upon the two, how motions are brought forward, how we choose to bring motions. I mean, Jim, you talked about a race to a motion and trying to prevent those sorts of things. And then secondly, how motions might get modified. That has not been, I think that's been very awkward for this board in times when there's been discussion regarding a motion, and then there's been inside that discussion, there's been an idea of a change of the motion or some modification of the motion, which should be facilitated in some manner, how we might try to navigate that. I have some ideas how we might try to navigate that, whether the original motion dies, whether the original person who makes the motion pulls the motion. That's one way by which to handle it. They also think that when motions get modified, making sure that the modified motion is truly saying what the intent is. Sometimes that gets a little bit fuzzy. There's discussion. What do we really mean by that discussion? And then how do we put that discussion into a motion that really clearly gives direction? That's fuzzy sometimes for me. I think one way to do that, Matt, is if we're discussing a modification of a motion, would be to frankly take a break. Would be for the board to, take an adjournment for a period of time, have some discussion about the language of that motion. I've seen that handled in that way when I've served on a school board. We've done that, where what is this? How are we going to, make sure we get the motion? It's great, staff will bring, language, staff recommended motions, and often that's what we do, right? We do the staff recommendation is what we move forward, and that's very, very clean and clear. But if we have a potentially a change to a motion, whether or not a pause in the meeting might be appropriate to make sure we get that language clear. I mean, I'd like your opinion of that, doing something like that as a board. Is that appropriate? Do you feel like that's okay? You understand what I'm asking?
Yes, I think I do understand. For the procedural rules, I would say that you've got a lot of discretion to figure out what process works well for you. What I would say, there are some firm limits, like the public meetings law, the obligation to have a quorum, the obligation that only a majority of the board has the authority to act for the board. Some of those are more hard and fast. So with having a break and then discussing the language in the motion, the only concern I would have there is that it not be a quorum of the board discussing that outside of the public meeting. But there's one or two members that want to consult and come up with language and then bring that back, working with staff or whomever, but so long as it's not a quorum that meets.
Yeah, I mean, I think a break is a good idea, but I have the same concern because appearances wise, even if we weren't going and having four of us talking together to try to work out the language in the break time, it might really come out kind of looking like that's what we're doing. And so I think we have to care about appearances as well as following public meetings law. Heath? And then
I would offer, as an old FFA Parley Pro guy, the boards like this, and particularly lay boards, would struggle in strict application of Robert's rules, right? And it doesn't, and we don't have a parliamentarian. We're just gonna kind of hack our way through. But what I would say in defense of Robert's Rules of Order is that it gives you a good way to know what we're talking about. And that to me is really important. What will happen is we'll have these agenda items where it's kind of a broad stroke, broad conversation. And we'll all be kind of talking generally about our priorities relative to the agenda item. And then somebody will make a motion and then we'll proceed directly to voting. And the problem for me is that all of that conversation that preceded that motion was in the abstract. And now we actually have a concrete motion in front of us that actually has real language and real things that I can kind of weigh against my priorities. And to me, it's really important in that moment that we talk about the motion before we proceed to vote. That is to say, we should have an opportunity for discussion. And then in that moment, if somebody proposes an amendment to that motion, we are no longer talking about the motion. We are talking about the motion as amended, which may raise very different issues, right? And so once that amendment is made, then it's time for an opportunity to discuss the amendment. And once we vote up or down the amendment, then we return to the motion as amended or not, and we discuss that. And the only reason I kind of walk through that framework is that, at least for me, in each of those segments, if you're able to observe Robert's rules, it lets the entire body know what we are talking about. And it's just a way to structure and organize the conversation. And I think, to me, it would be really valuable if we adhered a little more to that, with the understanding that there are limits to our application.
So Heath, can I add, just so,
Yes.
so I'm understanding what you're offering is that emotions brought forward in the language of that motion is specific, and that motion fails or goes down, and then a subsequent amendment to that motion is discussed.
Well, no, at that point, at least by the way I grew up doing it, is if the original motion fails, then you're taking a new motion. And what will often happen on a board like this is that the original motion is made, and then somebody by amendment makes a completely different direction, right? They're like, hey, we're going to completely change these policies. And either that will pass as amended or not. But under Robert's rules, if you adopt the amendment, then you still have to return to the primary motion as amended and discuss that and then proceed forward. And for me, again, it just, for a linear thinker, it helps me know, and I think it'll help the chair kind of tamp down on just kind of wild conversation that's deviating off on other things. We have a motion on the floor, we're discussing the motion, until such time as the motion fails or doesn't.
Yeah, I think as I listen to you, I think part of the problem, I think, is what we have is we have a motion made and seconded, and then we have a conversation, and then and before we're actually voting, someone is saying, "I'd really like to amend that motion," and I think that's probably where we are messing up. We really need to vote once something, have the conversation. And if someone says, hey, I'd like to amend that, I think in my role, I should say, we're going to have to make a vote on what has been, and I don't think I've done this clearly, what has been a motion made and seconded, and then after that vote up or down goes, then we can consider
Technically,
version, right? Does that make sense?
no, I mean, technically that would be a deviation from Robert's rules. That is to say, and we could decide to handle that way, but an amendment is a new motion in the middle. And so what you would do is you would discuss the amendment until such time as it actually succeeded or failed, and then return to the primary motion.
So I'm going to offer us a, oh, sorry, Liz, go ahead.
Liz was first. Yeah.
So I have this love-hate relationships with Robert Rules of Order. I really do. It just drives me crazy sometimes. But in my OWEB process, and they probably deal with, simpler issues comparatively. One of the things that I have seen that has worked is this putting up a motion, getting the second, doing the vote. And it is really, like you said, Jim, then it's up or down clean, and if it's not accepted, you move on, to the amendment. And that really is clear to me, and I don't know if that's what you're really talking about. Not, okay, but maybe that can be moved in. And then secondly, I want to, just this other thing that I have experienced in OWEB is that sort of the pace in which you bring that motion. And any member there, as the conversation moves on and it's clear that we are moving toward a motion, a board member can say, make a comment and then say, when appropriate, I would be ready to make a motion. And that sort of just telegraphs that either can continue or in a nice civil way, you can call on that board member when it's a logical conclusion to conversation. So I just offer that up.
Just to make a suggestion, so at Oregon State University, we have a faculty senate, and that brings together about 200 academics all in one place. Can you imagine what that's like? And so there's this issue comes up all the time, and they have sitting there listening to every meeting someone who is called a parliamentarian. And when a question arises, they ask that person, what's the approach here with Robert's rules? I don't know if Heath is our parliamentarian or not, but
Wanting to be, yeah.
and he might want to be, but that, for me, if I were in your shoes, Jim, and this kerfuffle erupted around, what's the best process, I'd want to go to somebody who knows the rules and say, what can we do? Because I'd be as lost as anybody.
You're reminding me of the old joke about why faculty fights are so vicious. Because there's so little at stake.
Yes, so I'm going to, the intensity of the arguments is inversely proportional to their importance.
Go ahead.
I think Ben actually had his hand up before me.
Ben.
Well, go ahead.
I was just gonna suggest, one way to handle this, absent, Robert's rules, maybe for the governance committee to tackle some loose structure around what we as a group might observe in the general course of managing these conversations. And I don't know if that would be attractive to you, Jim, insofar as you are not on the governance committee, but it would come back to this body for discussion, and it may be kind of helpful. We could go a long time on kind of why I think, at least, that kind of, if there's a motion to have apples and bananas for lunch and somebody amends it to, add grapes, that we should discuss grapes and vote on that before we return back to the primary motion of apples and bananas. But we don't actually need to go kind of a deep dive here on that. It may be something that we can delegate out and bring back with the understanding that this isn't code, but this is just kind of a professional understanding of how we're going to manage these conversations.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I mean, because I'm hearing a preference from several different board members and myself saying, if we have a motion that's been made and seconded, we should vote on that. And you're telling us that actually if somebody after that point suggests an amendment, we have to deal with that. And I honestly don't know who's right by Robert's Rules of Order, but it does get real messy trying to manage. I do know that. So I would love it if just dealing with that one specific thing, you guys can come back with a recommendation. I don't know who or how, but the whole idea of a parliamentarian would really be helpful for somebody in my role or for the poor soul who will follow.
Yeah, I was going to echo what Heath just said. And while I don't really relish this. I think it is important that the board governance committee take a crack at this. And I'm pulling up our board policy manual right here, and it says, otherwise, unless otherwise specified by the board, Robert's Rules of Order are adopted for the conduct of meetings. So we can specify. And it says unless otherwise specified by the board doesn't really define whether that's the board chair or the board as a whole. But I think it would be helpful for the board governance committee to, like you said, Heath, try to create some guidance that is hopefully helpful. And hopeful for your, successor, Jim. So I would be happy to, with your help, Heath and Liz, we can take this up.
So, and I would just add, I think we know, and this is kind of your successor, Jim. I think it's a great idea to walk through that. And I think we know the meetings that we're going to be in, or this future board will be in, this is going to happen, right? It's not a big mystery often that when we, this group sits around these tables and okay, this one's going to be kind of tough. We're going to, and if the chair were sitting there and could remind the board of the process, and this is how, not that we have a parliamentarian, but the chair herself would spell that out. This is how we're going to deal with amendments. That would be real helpful, I think, for a future board. Then maybe you can get away from the awkwardness.
Yeah. So did you have, you had suggested, maybe a break. Did you have other ideas? You had I think you said you had other ideas how to handle some of this.
Well, I think Liz brought up, bringing motions, how do you want to bring motions initially forward, right? I think you've expressed, and we've seen a race to motion, kind of a strategy surrounding it. And I think you've expressed that, is that really, what we should be doing? And I experienced years ago when we were first on this board, that happened, or it seemed like more. And that's fine. I think Liz brings a great idea. Somebody is prepared for a motion, expresses that. And I think that's a very, without maybe necessarily bringing the motion, expresses that.
Sure.
Okay, I'm kind of in line, let's continue our discussion here, and then that comes back. I think like when we were in Corvallis, I brought a motion, the discussion had happened, I brought a motion, and I think I think wanted more discussion, I think, or something. And so, but that would in fact prevent, like what Liz's suggestion might be a good process for the board to bring motions. So.
Good discussion. Any other? All right. Well, put that subject in your pocket. Okay, from your committee's pocket. We're a little ahead of schedule, and but is there anything anybody else wants to bring up from any of this discussion this morning? Next thing we will be doing, we'll be meeting at 11 o'clock for the executive session, but we've got a few minutes, and we'll definitely want to fit in a break here. So it's just how long we want to take for that break.
Yeah, we definitely need a break, but I just want to point out that later on this afternoon, we have a discussion around key performance measures, and I think that is a pretty weighty discussion that we need to dig into. And whether we take a break now or later, I would really like to hear from the entire board what their goals are for that key performance measure discussion. What are we going to come out of that with? Because as I understand it, there's some timelines if we're going to try to propose something for this year. So
Yeah, why don't we spend a few minutes on that? I've got some ideas around that, because I think we're going to have a probably all over the place conversation, given what's been presented to us from staff, and we have a situation where by April or May we have to be. The department has to be making some suggestions about what we're doing on these different key performance measures going forward. I'm suggesting that that one of the steps, I don't think we're going to be able to, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but, you know, have a lot of, we're not going to be voting. I'm guessing we're probably not going to have a whole lot of consensus around each and every one of what is there. So I'm thinking we'll try to set up a little work group to work with probably Kate and Tim to try to take the informal conversation that we have today into something where we're actually having something specific for the board to look at in March. And that's just a month away. So that's going to take a little work. But I just want to create the opportunity for everybody to go through. Tim's going to do a presentation, and so that we have some time to discuss each and every one of them. Open to obviously any other ideas on process, but
it did occur to me, the degree that the time allocated at the end of the day is not adequate for the conversation we want to have. I'm curious about your thoughts about that 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock hour tomorrow morning. It's scheduled just for kind of like opening comments and an opportunity to reflect from day one. If I were a betting man, I'd say that it'd last about 6 minutes. That may accommodate some of this conversation.
I think you're dead right. I mean, you know, we make a stab at creating these agendas, but I think if at all possible, we can extend and spend more time on key performance measures. Totally agreed. I think, you know, happy to modify this agenda. I think, you know, part of the problem here is that we set up, you know, our timeline and everything, and then last night I'm reading through, you know, the report on the key performance measure. I go, oh my God, we got a lot to talk about here. I'm sure all of you felt the same way.
I would agree, and I think Keith, there's as much time as we can carve out over the next day and a half to talk about this. I would be in favor. Perhaps this will come with Tim's presentation this afternoon, but maybe I've got a question for Kate. Just a little primer on, so I can be thinking about my remarks and my thoughts on these KPMs. A reminder on the deadline of when it's submitted to the legislature, and maybe if you could help us understand who owns this process and how much role the board plays in driving these measures. I think that would be helpful. And if this is premature and we just wait for Tim, that's fine too. But since we had a couple minutes, it would be helpful to understand the parameters within which we're working on this.
And I see Tim in the background, so when I get this wrong, Tim, you can correct me. So really, it's the first part of April is our deadline to submit something. And I think, so as an executive team, we all sat down, I think in August last year, and went through this and were equally overwhelmed by the work. And so we wanted to put it out here because, you know, we get a lot of feedback from stakeholders, but also you guys are very frustrated. We're frustrated with the KPMs because our business has changed from when these were last done. So we're also trying to think about maybe there's 2 or 3 that we try to chisel off and move forward right now, and then we set ourselves up for the next process. So of all the KPMs, don't feel like we have to have a full package that moves forward, but we need to make some progress on these pieces. And so this is getting your input, and then also the process is owned by the agency a little bit, working with the legislative body on what this looks like. You know, this is their KPMs to us as well, so they can measure our success. And so that's why too, we were thinking as we're going through these changes of a forest management plan or the Forest Practices Act, is like maybe we work through a few at a time. And also trying to determine what's the right number, right? So if you look, I think we have 12, and what's the right number for an agency that this complex of what we have? So those are the other thoughts that we've had in there as well. Does that help?
tell you right now, one of the concerns that I have, looking at a lot of the recommendations, and I'm particularly talking about the recommendations for pausing, and it's not, I think there's some legitimate arguments about why a number of those should be paused. My concern is just knowing how the world works is that if they're paused, they'll just disappear off the radar. So I'm going to be interested to know how we can have assurance that if we do, as a board, agree that, yeah, it's reasonable for us to pause a measure that should be measured because it's not workable right now, that it won't disappear into the ether. I mean, maybe it's kind of like speaking from the grave, but, can we get it on the agenda for 2008, 2009 meeting on some of these or something? Anyhow, that's a concern. Okay, shall we take a break? And we're gonna, I'm assuming we're gonna meet over there for the executive session at 11 o'clock. And then we have lunch at noon, and so we will continue with this key performance measure conversation at 1 o'clock. We're all back together in this room. Thank you.
So, under Robert's rules, amendments can be hostile. They can be hostile. So it kind of solves the race to make a motion question. That is to say, you can say, hey, I move that we stop harvesting state lands. And I'd say, I'd like to amend that motion and say, I move we increase harvesting on state lands by 10%. And if